Hey there, game devs. Welcome to this tutorial on how to create some explosion particle effects in the Unity game engine using the high definition render pipeline. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to create this explosion effect that you can see on screen now. So I'm assuming most of you will already have a Unity scene that you're working with. If not, I would recommend watching a video on how to set up an HDRP scene first. For this tutorial, I'll be working in a standard empty HDRP scene with just a plane as a makeshift floor and the directional light being disabled. So first off, what you'll want to do is go over to your hierarchy and create a particle system. This will bring in the default particle system with Unity. The next thing that we'll want to do is create a new material that we'll be adding onto this particle. Just call it really anything. We'll be creating the explosion fireball first, so you'd want to name it accordingly. And for this tutorial, we'll actually be using a custom shader, but you don't need to worry about not knowing how to code shader because we'll be using ones that Unity provides with HDRP. So what you'll want to do is head over to the first link in the description, which will take you to this page here. Here you can download some particle shaders that the Unity team has put together for HDRP. I'd recommend downloading the bottom right one as it is the most recent version that they've released. Just unzip it and drop the file into your Unity and you will get the provided shaders that are here. For this tutorial, we'll be using the particle unlit shader graph, but we'll also want to make a modification to it for the purposes of this explosion. So you want to open the particle unlit by just double clicking it, which will open it up inside of the Unity editor. And then what we'll want to do is go to the plus up here and create a new color parameter. We will call this emission. And we will change the mode from default to HDR and change the default color to white. This will act as our emission intensity for our particle. What you'll want to do next is move the emission into the shader graph. And you may think, oh, just plug it into the emission here, but you don't want to do that because that will overwrite colors with the emission color here. It kind of blends them together, which is not what we want for particles. So what we're going to do instead is create a multiply node and multiply the emission intensity color and the particle vertex color, and then use that as the color value instead of just the raw particle vertex color. Once you're done with that, that's all we're going to be doing, so you can just hit Save Asset and return back to the scene. So the reason why I have the light disabled in the scene is because I find that it's best to work on any emissive particles in a dark scene so that you don't accidentally blow things out in your actual game if they are used in a dark area. Now we'll want to go down to the renderer component of the particle system and go to where you made your new shader and just drag and drop it in there. You want to make sure that it's also actually set to the shader itself. So you can find that if you go into shader graphs, particle unlit. And now we'll begin actual work on the particle system. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the shape, change it from a cone to a sphere, and change the radius to something like 0.1 because we want our explosion to come from like a very small point. There are multiple ways to do this next part. You can either use a burst emission, or you can use a high rate over time, with a low duration and not looping. For this case, I'll be using the high emission rate with a low duration method, as I personally like how it looks better with explosions. So we'll change this value here to something like 500, and the duration to 0.2, which if we play this now, creates a outward burst of particles without them all appearing at the exact same time, which is why I'm not a fan of bursts for this case, but we will use them later because they are useful still. So now we should do something to properly set the speed of our particles. For this, I like to use the random between two constants so that you don't get all your particles moving at the same speed. Since this is a fireball, we want the particles moving fairly slowly, so let's try some values like 0.1 to 0.5. See how that looks. It's much slower kind of expansion of a fireball. They're lasting a little bit too long, though, so let's change the start lifetime to, again, random between two constants so they don't last all the same time. And let's try 2 to 2.5 seconds, which is much more reasonable that they don't spread out far too much. Next, let's try making it actually look like an explosion slightly. For that, we'll want to use color over lifetime here. And we'll want to create a gradient explosion color kind of thing. I've got one here, but I'll go through the process of how to make one yourself. So first, let's move this white slider back so we can keep this white area and create a new one over here just by clicking underneath of it. If you click on the color here, you can select the color. We'll go for a kind of bright yellow as our first initial color. Afterwards, let's create another one. This one being more of an orange, and we want to transition into a red. The best way to think of this is think of it like the particle losing heat. It starts off as a very bright white, and it transitions into a more temperate red, and then finishing off with a kind of dark brown black color. And now if we play the particle effect, you can see it's sort of slowly starting to take more of a form of a fireball. For this next step, we'll have to go back to our material here and change it from opaque to transparent. And we're going to go back into the color over lifetime. I'm going to create a node here on the alpha, and we're going to make the end of it here have a 0 alpha. Now the reason for this is so that we get a proper fade out of our particles instead of them just snapping out of existence. And if we go back to the fireball shader, or material, excuse me, and I pause that there, if we go over to the emission, we can change this intensity slider so we can get an actual glow coming off of the particles themselves, which is caused by the bloom in the Unity engine. So now if I hit play on it, see it's a much more vibrant color. Even that is a little too dull. I'd say probably set it to like a value of 8. Let's try that. That's a bit more explosion-like. If you want to see what my exposure is currently set to, it is set to a fixed value of 10. So if your explosion is looking slightly off, that could be the reason why. Now, this looks okay and all, but for an actual explosion, we'd want some textures to go along with it. There's not going to be any texture making in this video, but Unity actually has a very nice library for some particle textures, which is the second link in the description. If you follow the second link in the description, it will take you to this Unity blog here, where they have a big sequence full of different kinds of particle effects that you can download just for free and use in your game. For this video, we will be going down to Wispy Smoke 02 and downloading the flipbook. Once you've downloaded the flipbook, just extract the folder and move the .tga file into your Unity Assets folder. What we'll be doing now is applying the texture to here through the inspector. And if we go back here, that doesn't look right. So what we need to do now is go down to texture sheet animation and check that on. And then you'll want to change the tiling to 8x8 because that is what that targa file is in. And you can see now that is looking much more like an actual fireball than the just mess of cubes it was before. Now we'll want to give the fireball a bit more energy, because right now it kind of just floats there and doesn't really do anything. So what we'll want to do is go into the limit velocity over lifetime, and we'll want to set a speed cap to it. Since we want this to move fairly slow, we'll set the speed cap to 0.2. And we'll set the dampen to 0.5. That way it slows down rather quickly. And we will also change the start speed to something like 20 to 30. And as you can see there, it's a much more kind of expansion effect to it rather than the kind of like just slow spreading out that it was before, which is much more of just a more natural fireball effect. It makes it more similar to something that's like pressurized being detonated, releasing its inner gases. To add to this expansion effect, we'll also add a size over lifetime modifier here. And for the graphs, we will use this one, but we'll move it up to 0.5 because we don't want the particle to start off being tiny. So this one, you can see that now as the particle goes through its expansion process, the actual size of the particle expands as well. And the reason we have it at the halfway point is if it's down here, that does not look right, because there's too much empty space inside the explosion itself. So when it's at the 0.5, there's a lot less empty space, or a lot less possibility for the empty space to happen. Lastly, we will also add a collider to these particles, as we probably don't want them to clip through the ground, or more importantly, walls. And actually, yeah, we should change that off of local simulation space to world, as you most likely don't want your explosion to move around with the game objects it's attached to, unless you've got them going on inside of like a moving object or something. Alright, next up, let's create a secondary particle effect. Once again, we'll be going to the hierarchy and creating a new particle system. And for this one, let's create another material that is using the unlit shader graph. This one is not going to have a texture on it, but it will again use the same 8 emission intensity. Similarly to the fireball, we're going to change the shape from a cone to a sphere and reduce its radius to 0.1. I'm actually going to turn off the emission rate this time, and instead I'm going to set a burst of 200 particles, 300 particles. That looks like a decent amount. Let's go down to the renderer, change this from billboard to stretched billboard. We will change the length scale to 1 and the speed scale to 0.03. To make these more spark sized, we will also go back up here and change the start size to, let's try 0.03. Yeah, that's a decent spark size. So similarly to the fireball, we'll want a quick start speed that quickly dissipates over time, just to give it that punchy feeling. So again, let's create a random between 2 constants for this. And let's try something like 150 to 300, which is very high, but that's what we want for this particle effect. We're going to go to limit velocity over lifetime, set the max speed to 1 and a dampen value of 0.5. We're also going to turn off multiply by size. And let's try adding a bit of drag as well. Maybe like 0.3. 0.3 should be fine. The next step is getting the color for your sparks. What we'll want to do is go back over to the fireball, and either you can save this gradient by clicking this new button here, or what you can do as well is just right click copy and then go back over here into color over lifetime and then right click paste, which should set the color. Oh yeah, right, if you want to set the color, don't forget to use your new material. You know, it's always something small with game dev. It's always some little thing that you forget to actually do. There, now you can see that the particles are actually getting their color. Once again, set this to a transparent texture as well, so they don't just disappear out of nowhere. You know, let's actually go back up here, increase the length scale to like 1.5, and let's also increase the speed scale to 0.06, which looks a bit better. The next thing we'll want to do is go into size over lifetime, and we're going to have an opposite effect of the fireball, where the particles get smaller over time. The lifetime on these particles is probably also a little too long, so let's go in here, create a new random between 2 constants. Let's try 2.5 to 3 seconds. It's a bit better, but you know, these slow down too much, so let's change this to like 3 and then increase the drag. a bit as well. Oh, no. That's not working. A lot of experimentation when you're working with particles in Unity. I think the drag is still a little too high, which is causing some issues. Let's also try adding a slight amount of gravity onto the object using this gravity modifier. So probably like 0.5 be a good amount for some sparks. There, that's looking a lot more explosion spark-like. Let's also reduce the minimum start lifetime to 1.5 seconds, just so that there's a bit more variance in the actual spark lifetime themselves. And the last thing that we'll want on the sparks is a collision. For this one, we'll want to have a bit more detail than just having it plainly collide to stuff, because as you can see, the particles are very bouncy by default. So to fix this, there's a couple of things that we'll want to do. First of all, set the bounce to 0.5, so it only gets half of the bounce value, but now you can see that our particles slide across the ground. So we'll also want a dampen value, which we will set to 0.25, which basically means they'll lose a quarter of their velocity whenever they collide with something. And if you want to, you can add a lifetime loss as well, which means that whenever a particle hits an object, it will lose a part of its lifetime, which in this case could simulate like the spark particle losing its temperature touching an object. Now let's move on to the last particle system that we'll be making for this, which will be the dust particles that are coming off of the sparks. You could use a trail, but I think that this works much better for an explosion trail. So because this particle will be a subemitter, we do not need a shape on this, because it's going to be spawning directly on top of the particles. We do not want a start speed with it either. And let's just get some sparks for comparison speed. Or not speed, but comparison size, I meant to say. So we can compare like what size we want the smoke particles to be in comparison to the actual sparks themselves. So let's just decrease the size to what I think would be reasonable. Something about there, so 0.15. Again, we're going to want to create another new material. In this case, I'm just going to duplicate the sparks material and rename it to dust. I'm also going to reduce the intensity of it down to 2. I'm going to keep a little bit of intensity on it, just to keep with that fiery glowing. Because even though the dust particles themselves may not be glowing, if you have an emission on it, it might give off the sense of like, oh, it's being illuminated by the actual fire. So next, we'll want to drag our dust particles into here to replace it. This one will not be using a color over lifetime, or actually, no, it will. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually set the color in the main part, and just set the base color to something like a light brownish color. In the color over lifetime, we're not going to be using the color itself, but instead we're going to use an alpha value, and we're going to blend it over the distance. So with this, we should actually attach it to the particle system itself so that we can visualize how it's going to behave. Before you do this, you should make sure that this particle system is stopped, and then you child it to that object. I don't know if it matters where it is, but it's best to just zero your stuff out anyway. And then if you scroll down here to sub-emitters, turn that on, stop this again. And in the sub-emitters, you can drag your particle system onto here. And now, well, first off, I need to go back here and increase the emission rate from 10 to something like 100. And this is why you should not edit stuff while that's running, because it can get very laggy. 100 is a bit much. Let's decrease that to like 25 maybe. No, that's still not enough. Let's try 50. And increase the max particles to 3000. Let's try. The lifetime will want to be probably about like 3 seconds. Once again, Unity freezing up because it does not like when you edit particles that are sub-emitters. And now what we'll want to do is have a very light gravity modifier on these objects, just to kind of simulate like dust falling to the ground very slowly. That is not very slowly. Try something like 0.01. Very, very slow. That's a little too slow now. So probably about 0.03 should work. Yeah, that works decently as like dust particles falling. We'll also want some variance, or not variance per se, but something going on and just not static squares just sitting there. So what we will do is we will have a rotation over lifetime. And once this loads, we will use the 45. Or, you know what, that's a little too slow. Let's go with 15. So I'll rotate 15 degrees per second, which will just add a little bit of a visual touch to the particles themselves. So now we can see as the particles fall, they kind of slowly rotate towards the ground. On the color of the particle itself, it would probably be a good idea to change the alpha to a lower value, because as it stands right now, our particles are a little too thick to see through. So now, if I do that and restart, it's a much cleaner effect going on with the color of the dust particles. And now, what we'll want to do is attach this particle system to the fireball. And once again, zero things out. And now, if I stop the particle effect, we can see the final completed effect. Once again, you'll probably want to not have these being on local. You'll want them on world so they don't move around with the actual object itself. The sparks are still on local there. So now that's how you get a, I'd say, decent looking particle effect for explosions. Of course, there's always certainly like more work that can be put into these. And I'd highly recommend that people like play around with this and try to see like how they can improve on it. So this creates a pretty good starting point for a explosion effect that you can use inside of your games for things like, say, a barrel exploding. If you want to check out some more of the particle effect work that I've done, you can check out the game that I'm currently working on, which is HDR High Dynamic Range. It's a student project that is consisting of 7 team members, and we would very much appreciate any feedback or criticism that you have for a game. The open alpha was just released a couple days ago, and of course it's got some bugs in it, but you know, getting some feedback about anything related to gameplay or anything art related would be very much appreciated. And that concludes everything for this tutorial. I'll leave off the video with some gameplay alpha footage of HDR High Dynamic Range.